Welcome to Magicians Talking Magic. My name is Grimazing, and today on the podcast we have one of Magic's most influential conjurers. Today's guest is a creator, performer, historian, a true ambassador of astonishment, Double J, Joshua J. Thank you so much for being on Magicians Talking Magic today.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Now, on September 28th, The Forbidden Door will open. Your latest book, How Magicians Think, isn't just for magicians, but anyone who wants to take their passion to the highest of levels. What were some of your key goals when you initiated this project?
Yeah, great question, and I'm glad you asked. So I asked, let me back up and answer it this way. I asked one of my writer friends for advice, Joe Posnanski, who wrote the book on Houdini, the biography on Houdini that came out last year, but he's a very decorated sports writer. And I said, hey, I can't believe it, but I've just been commissioned to write my dream book. This is like the book I was destined to write. It's, I think, the book I'm most excited to be a part of. I don't know if I'll ever do anything this significant. I'm feeling overwhelmed. What advice do you have? And the advice that he gave me basically is this. He said, figure out what your book is about. Figure out in one sentence what the goal of your book is, the core value of your book. And write it down on a piece of paper and stick it to your monitor so that you're staring at it throughout this whole process, because you're going to over-research and overwrite and under-research and underwrite, and you're going to go through peaks and valleys. But if you have that as your North Star, you will always get back to it. And so the question you're asking is, what did I write on that piece of paper? And what I eventually settled on is this. I want to deepen people's appreciation for magic and magicians. That's it. That is it. Another way of putting it that is perhaps less eloquent is I want to increase people's magical fluency, like fluency in a language, right? I want people to not think of magic as something binary that they like or don't like, that they get or they don't get, but as shades of gray, a million shades of gray, the way that people are willing to go to films and afterwards sit around and debate those films, even if they have no particular background in films, or they do the same for food, they do the same for Star Wars plots. Why is it that they don't have any magical fluency? And can we fix that? That's the goal of the book.
I love that goal of the book because as I'm a huge pro wrestling fan, and I've always been curious, why has magic not hit that realm of pro wrestling, that fandom of pro wrestling? And it feels like it's because as magicians, we tend to stay locked in with our secrets. How important do you think it is embracing like the fandom of magic outside of just, hobbyist and practicing magicians?
Well, super important. And in fact, I think it's just an untapped potential, which is both really discouraging and really encouraging, depending on how you look at it. Like, it's so rare to come across somebody who truly hates magic. And I'll preface this by saying that, like, a lot of times when I'm working, people will go, oh, you're a magician, I hate magic, oh God. But it's so clear that that's a performative statement. It's so clear that that's done for attention or to be provocative. And I think a lot of your listeners can relate to this. How many times does a spectator start by going, oh, I hate magic, and then they're the ones that actually are your biggest cheerleader or the biggest fan? I think that they just hate a magician that they saw, or that they view magic as a puzzle to be solved. And when they're confronted with something that's like really interesting and great, they don't hate it as much as they thought they did. So I think that the truth of the matter is most people love magic, but most people don't know how to love magic. And this book, How Magicians Think, is, I hope, a roadmap to showing people what it is they love and why it is they love it.
Now, how did you come about approaching this roadmap to allow people in, to kind of break the fourth wall, to get people to be like, oh, I get it. I see what's so interesting and fascinating about magic?
Yeah, there's so many ways I want to answer this question. It's a great question. Thank you. The surface level way I can answer it is this. The book's format I'm really excited about. And the book's format is simply this. It is 52 questions asked and answered. So, we were talking before we started recording about cruise ship magic, and I have done a fair amount of cruise ship work. And in the old days, they don't do this anymore. They used to seat you with the guests some nights. So like you're sitting with total strangers and it's like Groundhog Day because every time it's like, what do you do? Where are you from? And when they find out you're the magician performing later that week, they have 8 trillion questions for you. And what I realized is those questions fascinate people. Those questions are everything to people. Was Houdini as good as everybody says? What do you do if you screw up a trick on stage? Do you create your own material? Who's the best magician alive? What's the weirdest thing that's ever happened on stage? Do you ever mess up a trick? Like these are great questions. And these are questions that people don't ask from a standpoint of being smartasses. They ask from a standpoint of genuine curiosity. And the problem is that most magicians answer those questions with smartass answers or trite answers like, well, if I told you, it wouldn't be a mystery, would it? But actually, the real answers to those questions are pretty fascinating. Yes, Houdini was as good as everybody says in some respects, but Houdini wasn't the greatest magician in history. He was actually the greatest marketer in history. Let me give you an example. And now you're off and running in a fascinating story that's going to deepen people's appreciation for what magicians do. So my surface level answer to your question is I attempt to go about achieving that goal by answering all the questions and core curiosities that I think people have. The deeper answer to your question is that I overwrote the book by about 30-40%. In other words, I know what they wanted me to turn in, roughly about a 300-page manuscript, a certain amount of words, and I wrote way more than that with the understanding that a lot of it would be cut. But I wanted to give non-magicians and people who were enthusiastic about this project at my publisher the chance to go, Josh, this is so interesting of how you watch a magic show. Or, Josh, I'm totally lost. Like, I know you want to explain misdirection, but after this point, from this page to this page, I just think it's inside baseball. Fine, great. We know what has to go. We know what can stay. And as usual, as of course, the parts that people responded to were not always the parts I thought they would, and the parts that I thought were so fascinating often ended up on the cutting room floor. Specifically, to go even deeper, I have a lot of feelings about magical fluency, about getting magicians and our audiences more fluent and conversant in what makes for great magic. None of that ended up in the book because it is so inside baseball, but I have written a great deal about it, and it will come out in some form sometime in the future. But I have a really strong belief that the key to everything good in magic in our future is helping lift the audience up to understand magic in a more complete and deep way, to see the artistry behind great magical thinking. And unfortunately, that starts with raising up the level of how magicians view magic shows and their own work. And we have so much work to do on that. And, that's probably its own podcast in itself. But it's endlessly fascinating for me to think about the steps and ways to go about that.
You touched on so many huge topics of conversation right there. We tend to agree on magicians talking magic. We've been talking about how it'd be great to see magic. When you go see a guitar player, a lot of people are hobbyist guitar players, but when you see, that certain guitar player riff on stage, you're like, oh, no one can do it like that.
Right.
That's so tremendous. But that person has appreciation because they've dabbled in it a little bit, right? It creates
Exactly.
more fandom and everything. The one thing, though, that we talk about too is that we've been learning that the real magic sometimes is actually in answering the questions, the interesting questions. And I found myself, I'm a strolling performer, that I started to do less magic tricks and answer and even ask more questions. Do you find that too?
Yes, of course. I mean, that's part of, what we call coloration, right? Is coloring in the experience with depth, with coming in and giving people a more complete feeling. I think that one of the great advances that we've made in the last, let's call it 30, 40 years, is that if you look at vintage magicians and vintage magic performances, it is many different styles, many different kinds of magic, many different personalities, but they're all pretty much universal in that they are hiding everything behind the curtain. Truly, they don't want you to see process. They don't want you to see decision making. They want you to see seamless magic show. It's that perfect Vaseline smile. It's that, you know, debonair attitude, and it whatever it is, it's concealing any kind of process or development. And partly due to social media, partly due to access. And what I mean by access is we have access now to all our favorite musicians and actors and wrestlers, and we get to see that they're in a process of evolution and developing things. And now you wouldn't think of releasing a pop record unless you talked about who the producers were and how you developed it and the songs and hearing early versions. And the same is true in magic. I think that what's wonderful is now, as magicians, we get to show process. And part of showing process could be you at a table during a restaurant gig saying to somebody, this is something I've been working on for about the last 9 months, which is new to me, by the way. 9 months is just the beginning of when a trick, already just packed into that one sentence is like, wait a minute, 9 months of work and the trick is new? Tricks take 9 months to develop. Already you've deepened the appreciation for your audience. By the way, you mentioned wrestling. Have
Yeah.
you read the booklet that Vanishing Ink put out by Caleb Wiles? It's a collection of tricks called High Spots, but it starts with a great little essay about some parallels between magic and pro wrestling.
100% yes. And we recently had Caleb on the podcast too.
Oh,
Caleb
nice.
is a real gem of a person.
Yeah, awesome. Just
But
making
there's
sure.
so many comparisons to wrestling and magic, and I really think the one that's missing is that fandom that we're talking about. And
Yeah,
it comes down to there's still a debate. And how do you? I'm actually curious how you handle this debate, because there's still magicians and a school of magicians are like, we don't want to show the inside. We don't want to reveal anything. We want to keep it that squeaky clean magic show. We want to keep that mystery and
yeah.
ambience, which I understand fits some characters and personas, but there's still, a peek behind the curtain at some time, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think it's necessary or helpful to like pass judgment on people who make that decision to kind of conceal more than they reveal.
Right.
That line is different for everybody. I just think that it wasn't a lane before. Like, name me a magician before 1940, and you can. Robert Houdin was a notable exception, but name me a magician before 1940 whose real focus was on that behind the curtain stuff, on that, let me show you the development of my stuff. Let me show you the behind the scenes. Let me show you all the work that goes into these tricks as I develop it. That was all kept from the public. That was magician stuff. And I just think that in this modern age, this is the time where we can show people that, hey, tricks don't just appear in our act. They take months, years to develop. They take collaboration. They take technology and subtlety and psychology and practice and all these things.
Working on a huge project like this and talking about big topics in magic, did you learn anything personally from working on this whole thing?
Oh, I mean, I learned a ton. Um, I mean, I learned something in every topic I went to think about because again, I'm reading this book called Deep Work. Maybe you're familiar with it. It's a book on basically extolling the virtues of, in the modern age, we are constantly being coerced into multitasking and getting things done quickly and getting things done in a way that's just sufficient and nothing more. But deep work would mean unplugging and doing a job with 100% focus. And so I can take a topic that I feel like, I've spoken on Houdini, I've done research on Houdini, I've written on Houdini. Okay, Houdini, I'm going to write on Houdini and I'm probably know what I'm talking about. But then when you actually sit down and talk about Houdini through the prism of how magicians think, you are really learning new things because you're organizing your thoughts in new ways. Or I think I understood pretty well about how magicians create their own tricks. I spend a big part of my life doing it. But when I actually organize my thoughts and have to transmit it in a way that makes sense to a layperson reader, you're learning new things about it. And, I mean, I talk about this all the time. Very few magicians decide that part of their path is to lecture. And I'm one of those magicians. But like, there's a great lesson in lecturing on original material because it forces you to look at what we English major people would call look at your work on a line edit basis. In other words, lots of magicians are critical of their own work and have great material. But how many, when you're describing a trick, to somebody and you say, take the four aces, square them on top of the deck, then set the deck down, do the move. Now pick up the deck, square it again. Wait. Why would you put the deck down only to pick it up again a second later and square it? It makes no sense. But you're not going to find those little insights unless you are actually out loud giving the play-by-play of that trick to somebody else, and then you start to go, well, actually, yeah, I don't know why I do that. That's a terrible idea, so I learn a great deal about my tricks in the process of writing them up and describing them, and the same with all these topics in How Magicians Think.
This seems to be a huge collaboration project too, working with tons of other magicians, and I've even seen on the page comedians like Pete Holmes as well.
Yeah. Well, so Pete Holmes, he wasn't a collaborator on the book itself. That was a fun story. I did this show in New York called Six Impossible Things for 18 months. And it was mental. I mean, one night early in the run too, which is a shame because I think the show grew so much. And I think of all the people who saw it early and so wish they could have seen it, after like the third extension when I think it really hit its stride. But anyway, Pete Holmes came to the show. And there he was. It was like, there's Pete Holmes, one of my favorite comedians, a guy who clearly loves and appreciates magic. And, he came and he watched the show and he was just so kind. And by the way, I mean, talk about nightmare things. So, I did the show in an escape room because the whole idea was it's 6 tricks, each one in a different environment. So one you're one-on-one, one you're in the dark, one you're standing, one you're surrounded, one you're laying on your back looking at the ceiling, all these different environments. And the show worked very nicely, but the venue was kind of rough. Like the venue, was like an escape room. It's in a basement in Chinatown, and its grittiness was one of the things people liked best about it. But there is no debate. It was a very gritty environment. Like you don't want to eat off the floor in that place. Like it was it was a basement in Chinatown. And the night that Pete Holmes came, he came with his, at the time, pregnant wife, and the air conditioner system had gone out. And it was the summer. And truly, like, credit to him that he didn't leave with his poor wife, who's like, very pregnant and super over it. We are all sweating through our clothes. And he stayed the whole time, and he stayed afterward. And he said to me afterward, he was like, I'm a fan. How can I help? How can I? And I was like, man, you're blowing my mind right now. Just the fact of having you here is like the greatest honor for me. And like all my staff was like freaking out, and they all love Pete Holmes. But I kept that in the back of my mind. And when I wrote the book, I sent it to him and I said, look, you don't owe me anything. You don't even know me. I don't know if you remember, but you saw the show of mine. I would love it if you'd read this book. And a few days later, he said, I read it. And here's a quote for you. So
That's amazing. That's so incredible. Vanishing Ink, Six Impossible Things, Magi Fest, How Magicians Think. How important is collaborating with a group of people, a team of people, sharing ideas?
it's the most important thing. And also it's something you have to keep at arm's length. Collaboration, this is a fascinating, endlessly fascinating topic. I mean, at the end of the day, I have to trust my instincts. But in order to really weigh all the options, I have to build a consensus. So like, I'll give you an example from my life right now that's on my mind. That I have meetings all day today, but between these meetings, my entire focus is going to be this. There's a trick that I created some years ago called Trojan Deck. And it's a trick where you shuffle a deck and I shuffle a deck, and they end up completely matching. And I think my method for doing it, which is different than the mathematical methods and the technical it's a totally kind of departure from all of that. And I think it's really effective, and it's closed my shows for many years. It was part of Six Impossible Things. But here's the dilemma. The presentation that I use with it is the true story of how my parents met. And it's this weird kind of Benjamin Button type story where he gets a phone call, and if he doesn't get the phone call and he doesn't miss the parking spot, then he misses walking in the restaurant at the moment she's walking out, and she spilled coffee on her dress, so she was in at that exact moment and passing in the hall. And if none of those things happen, they don't meet in the middle. They don't fall in love. They don't have a kid. I don't exist. I'm not doing the card trick, right? Which I think is like a really nice parallel to a trick in which a deck of cards is shuffled, and if every shuffle and cut and whatever is not dealt out, it doesn't make sense. So I really like this presentation, but this presentation is 7 minutes long. So now we are marketing the trick. We're putting the trick out. I'm done using it in my shows, so I'm releasing it to the magic community. And in a week's time at Magi Fest, I'm going to present it on stage. But my dilemma is I don't know that presenting it with that performance is doing the trick justice in that environment. Also, I don't know if I want to be doing a 7 minute performance piece that really takes a lot out of me every time I demo the trick to other magicians. So, my question is, can I come up with an equally interesting but quicker, punchier presentation about odds, about likelihood, these sorts of things that I can use in other ways? Because also, like, as much as it closes my show, there are just times I know it is just so not time to tell a story about my mom and dad. It's just not the right time. And half of people who know me and know the development of that trick and have seen what it can do are like, you'd be crazy to mess with that. Just do it the way you do it and let other people worry about how long it is. And other people are like, no, I get it. Like, I think it's going to be weird in a magic lecture to take 7 minutes to perform a trick that really only ought to take 2 or 3. And so I'm trying to build a consensus. And then in the end, I'm going to go with my gut. And my gut is telling me not to do this long-ish performance, but I may end up there. So we'll have to see in a week's time.
You must put yourself in a constant unique situation because all of your magic tricks that you release to the public are usually, very personal to you as a
Yeah.
presentation that it's your story.
Yeah.
When you go to release that must be how challenging is it, first of all, to give that up to the magic community and kind of release it? Or is it kind of like, this is part of what needs to happen, I need to let it go, so to increase the fandom kind of thing? And then also, when it comes to this, what you're kicking around right now, the idea of, do I just give my personal presentation and see maybe another magician do that, which would be weird? Or do we have to really create something else that I can also feel as good about?
I mean, these are great questions. You know, my feeling is that, I mean, it's a personal choice, of course. Like, I don't, what I'm about to say is not meant to come off as judgy to anybody else, but I can just tell you for myself. Like, my feeling is that magicians are not very productive people generally. And even clever magicians don't come up with a ton of stuff. And that's disappointing to me. And like, I think part of the problem is they hold on to things too preciously and they don't push themselves. And I'm not talking about everybody. Obviously, there are many extraordinary magicians, but I've closed my show with this trick for 7 or 8 years. Like, it's part of the ecosystem I've created that I want credit and to protect this idea. It's not like I'm never going to use it again, but I've used it for a time and I'm ready to share it. It does the technology of this trick is how I close my parlor show as well. It's just basically a way to switch decks without switching decks, like right in front of people without touching it. Um, it's time to share it for me. Obviously, it is a little bit of a bummer when I go to do balance and somebody else is like truly telling the same story of prison magic, and I'm like, but that's not your life, that's my life. But that's few and far between. And I mean, there's great professional courtesy. There have been a few times when people have been like, I want to do out of sight on TV, and it's like, no, I'm gonna do out of sight on TV when I plan to do it. But thank you for asking. Um, I just think that part of the reason that I can push myself to come up with new material is that it goes through this cycle. I come up with it, I hone it, I take it as far as I can possibly take it, and then I put it out.
You kind of touched on it there too, that magicians tend to be unproductive. You, as we all observe the magic world, you've come out with so many books and material and a company with Andy and
Yeah.
Magi Fest, rejuvenating Magi Fest. What do you think it is that makes you just take on these challenges, go for it, and continue? And not kind of, is it courage, or do you think it's courage? Is it risk taking?
I don't know if it's courage. It comes entirely from a place of passion, and that's not trite and just for your podcast. I mean that. I really do mean that. Like, if you could see our workflow at Vanishing Ink, we take on books we know are not going to sell, but they excite us. They're books we want to read. And if we don't think they're going to sell, we find a way to fund them anyway because we think they need to be done. And if we have gotten at a juncture where a trick to come out, actually we need a different die and this has to be totally remade, and it's going to triple the cost of the trick, and we can't triple the cost at the retail level because it won't sell, and so we end up selling a trick at a loss leader. And we do that all the time because, again, we're just excited to put out the trick in the way we think it should come out. And of course we have successes too, and we have books that sell really well and tricks that are big sellers. um, I think it's passion for me. I get excited about ideas and I want to be part of them. I loved what David Blaine said at the Davos forum, where he said his economic system is this simple. Whenever he gets an offer to do a show, he asks himself, "Would I do this for $1?" And if the answer is yes, he'll do it for whatever money is negotiated. And if the answer is no, there is truly no amount of money that he would do it for. Not $1 million, not $10 million. He just wouldn't do it. And similarly, I think that's kind of the way my life is governed. It's like if I get an offer to do a show, I just got an offer to go to Bulgaria. And my first question is not how much money they have. My first question is like, yeah, if there's time to sightsee, I think I'd like to do this, because I want to go to Bulgaria. And so I want to make that show work. And there are other shows, lucrative shows that come through, and I'm like, you need to hire, this guy because I'm not your guy for that. It doesn't sound like I want to be competing against a band walking around. I think that the other thing to think about, because you've very kindly pointed out all these different things I'm doing, is I don't put magic down very often. I can't control what talent I have or what things are going to succeed, but I can make sure I work harder than everybody else around me. And I do. I mean, I very rarely take breaks. So, I can fit a lot in bandwidth wise because I'm willing to do the work.
Do you have like a daily mantra or anything like that that you live by?
I don't think so. I mean, magic is the kind of guiding light. And I know that sounds really trite, even coming out of my mouth, but I do it because it's there. The famous quote, you climb the mountain because it's there in front. I am really interested in constantly pushing things as far as I can. And, I'm in the process of kind of updating and revamping my parlor show that I've been doing for many years in different forms. And I'm revisiting tricks that work just fine and they get big laughs and big oohs and ahs, but I know they can be better and I know that they can be more deceptive, and it's coming at great strain and expense and hassle, but I want to make those little beats even stronger for when I hit the book tour.
Final thought on the podcast. For all of us as magicians as a whole, whether you're a hobbyist, an amateur, or a professional, what is the best way? What is one thing that we could all do today to help increase the fandom of magic?
It's a great question.
Besides buying your new book, I guess.
That's a great question. And by what you're using the phrase increase the fandom, I mean, I take that to mean deepen people's appreciation for
Deepen
magic,
people's
right?
appreciation, yeah.
Wow. I mean, the easy answer is to do great work, right? I mean, that's the answer everybody else would give you. Is if you do great magic, you are a great ambassador for magicians, and then the next time your audience sees a magician, they're going to think more fondly on it. I don't think I want that to be my answer because that's everybody else's answer. So I'll let that be everybody else's answer. I think that it's something you touched on earlier, which is you said you're doing less material, but you're kind of being more present and infusing your magic with an attempt to answer those questions. And so my more nuanced answer would be, I think you should think about what core curiosities your audience has and try and answer those questions. So when your audience sees you do an amazing, breathtaking trick and they say to themselves, God, how long did it take this person to learn that? I hope you will, in your work, find a way to satisfy that answer. Or, oh, I just love that feeling of magic. Find a way to tell people why it is that they can't explain that they love that feeling. And I think if you can answer those questions, you create a serious, lifelong appreciation for magic.
we're often one ahead in our magic, we can be one ahead in our answers too. Josh, this has been an incredible conversation on magic today. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks for listening to this week's Magicians Talking Magic. Josh's new book is now available at your favorite magic store. Are you looking for more Magicians Talking Magic? Then be sure to join our Discord to keep the conversation going. And make sure to subscribe to YouTube for bonus content. On behalf of Ryan and myself, Shablazam Tadoozle. Meow. I know, I forgot to ask Josh to meow.